It was a winter night, not unlike many others on board the Sea Wanderer, an old cargo ship that had spent far too many years braving unforgiving seas. I had signed up for a series of long voyages for the steady pay, and it was the kind of work that didn't ask too many questions. You do your job, keep your head down, and hope you get through it without any unexpected trouble. It wasn't luxurious, but for someone like me, who was used to the salty spray and quiet nights, it was exactly what I needed. Until that night. It must have been around 2 a.m., the kind of hour where everything is asleep, and even the ocean itself seems to have drifted off to dream. I was assigned the night shift, doing a routine check of the technical compartments. The engine thrummed dully beneath the soles of my boots, a comforting reminder of the life flowing through the ship's bones. Everything was quiet except for the occasional groan of metal against metal as the ship flexed against the waves. That night, I was making my way to the lower deck where the auxiliary machinery was stored. It was dim. Hell, even calling it dim would be generous. The weak overhead bulbs flickered in an unsteady rhythm, casting trembling shadows that seemed to dance and sway as I walked by. There was something about the old wiring. The light never quite seemed stable down there, like the ship was fighting with its own ghosts. I reached the door to the technical room, pulling it open with a bit of effort. It always stuck, especially when the air was cold and the hinges groaned. The room was cluttered with pipes, gauges, and old tools that hadn't been touched in years, everything covered in a thin film of dust and the faintest sheen of rust. As I stepped in, I swear I felt a sudden chill that cut straight to my bones. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that brings a feeling, a sense that something was wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. I brushed it off, figuring it was just my nerves playing tricks on me in the half-darkness. It was then, as I was about to start my inspection, that I saw it, a flash of orange moving just at the edge of my vision, slipping past the doorframe and disappearing into the shadows of the narrow corridor outside. It wasn't a natural orange either, more like the bright, high-vis kind you'd see on safety jackets or emergency suits. I paused, staring at the now empty doorway. I could feel my heartbeat pick up, thumping in my ears as the sudden silence pressed in. It didn't make sense. Nobody should have been down here, especially not at that hour. The rest of the crew was either asleep or up on the bridge. I stood there, debating whether to call it in, but then I figured I'd just go check. Maybe one of the guys had forgotten something or was messing around. It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to get a laugh out of spooking the night shift. I stepped back out into the corridor, my boots echoing dully against the metal floor. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to shift, stretching long and thin across the walls. I called out, my voice sounding small against the groaning of the ship. "Hey, who's there?" I waited, but there was no answer, just the slow drip of condensation from the pipes overhead and the distant, muffled churn of the waves. I moved further down the corridor, the air growing colder with each step. It wasn't until I reached the end by the storage room that I saw the door was slightly ajar. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up, an uneasy tightness coiling in my stomach. I leaned forward, nudging the door open with my shoulder. The hinge let out a low, creaking moan, and the door swung inwards. The storage room was small, barely big enough to fit the shelves crammed against the walls. The light overhead was weak, and it cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. I glanced around, expecting to see someone hiding, but there was nothing. Just rows of dusty tools and cleaning supplies. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it, a soft click behind me. The door slammed shut. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. My hand shot out, trying the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic gripped me, cold and sharp, and I pounded against the door, shouting, "Hey! Open up!" This isn't funny. But there was no answer. Just the hollow echo of my voice against the metal walls. The cold deepened, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin but reaches inside you, seizing your lungs and making it hard to breathe. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam flickering on with a weak sputter. I swept it across the room, my breath coming out in short, frosty puffs. That's when I saw it again, just for a second. A flash of orange, slipping between the shelves at the far end of the room. My chest tightened, and I felt a shiver race down my spine. I took a step forward, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it followed. "Who's there?" My voice was barely more than a whisper. I could feel my mouth going dry, my pulse drumming in my ears. The orange figure moved again, and this time I caught a glimpse. A tall, shadowy shape, wrapped in something bright and tattered, like an old survival suit. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and cold, watching me. I backed away, my hand groping for the door handle again, twisting it frantically. The figure didn't move, just stood there, almost blending into the dark, like it was waiting. Suddenly, the lights above flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness before sputtering back on, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. The door behind me gave way with a sudden jolt, and I stumbled backward into the corridor, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the metal floor, the cold air biting at my skin. I found the first mate on the bridge, his eyes narrowing as I tried to explain what had happened. He didn't believe me, of course. Who would? He gave me a skeptical look, clapped me on the shoulder, and told me to get some rest, that I was probably just tired. But there was something in his eyes, something that told me he knew more than he was letting on. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed in my bunk, my eyes wide open, listening to every creak and groan of the ship, every whisper of wind against the hull. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever I'd seen was still there, somewhere in the shadows, watching. The next morning, I cornered one of the older crew members, a guy named Marcus, who'd been on the Sea Wanderer for years. I told him about the orange figure, the cold, the door that wouldn't open. His face went pale, and he glanced around before leaning in close, his voice barely a whisper. "You're not the first, you know," he said, his eyes darting nervously to the door. "They say it's one of the old crew. Back when the ship was still new, there was an accident. One of the engineers got trapped down below. There was a fire, and they couldn't get to him in time. By the time they put it out, all they found was his suit, burnt and torn, still bright orange." A chill ran through me, settling deep in my bones. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell Marcus he was just trying to scare me, but the look in his eyes was too real. He believed it, and after what I'd seen, I couldn't help but believe it too. That night I refused to go back down to the lower decks. I stayed up on the bridge, keeping to the light, my eyes scanning the dark corners, watching for any hint of movement. And just as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., I saw it again. A flash of orange, slipping silently through the shadows below and disappearing into the dark. I don't know what it wants, or why it's still here. Maybe it's trapped, caught between the metal walls of this old ship, unable to move on. Or maybe it's just looking for someone to take its place, to share its cold, endless vigil in the dark. Marcus told me that there had been other sailors before me who had seen the orange figure, and none of them stayed on the ship longer than one voyage. Some of them quit immediately after the encounter. Others simply disappeared without a trace. It was as if that figure had a choice. It only appeared to those it wanted, like a curse passed down from one sailor to another, spanning the ship's long history. He looked at me, his voice low and heavy. "It doesn't just show itself to anyone, you know. Once you've seen it, it's like you're marked. Most guys never see it, and if you're lucky, maybe it'll let you be." There was something in Marcus's eyes that told me he was speaking from experience. His own hands were trembling as he lit a cigarette, and he took a deep drag, exhaling slowly as he stared out over the dark waves. I stayed silent for a moment, trying to process everything he was telling me. The wind whipped around us, howling through the steel structures of the ship. The sky was a dark, endless void above, stars shimmering like cold, indifferent eyes. I could feel the chill sinking deeper into my skin, like that presence still hadn't let go of me entirely. I thought about the face, if it even had a face, that I'd seen. Or rather, the emptiness beneath the hood of that tattered survival suit. It wasn't something I could easily forget. "Marcus, have you seen it?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer at first. He just looked at me, his eyes tired, the lines on his face more pronounced under the pale moonlight. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Years ago. I was just a young hand on this ship, like you. Thought it was all stories to keep us in line, you know? But I saw it, down in the storage compartment, just like you. His voice trailed off, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. I got off at the next port, swore I'd never set foot on this ship again. But here I am, years later, back again. Sometimes you don't get a choice. That last part struck me harder than I expected. You came back? I asked, incredulous. Why? He sighed, shaking his head. Life has a way of pulling you back to the places you don't want to be. Maybe I thought I could face it. Maybe I thought if I could understand it, it wouldn't be so bad. He gave a bitter laugh, tossing the cigarette overboard. Turns out, you never really understand it. You just survive it, or you don't. For the next few days, I tried to avoid the lower decks. I took shifts above, helping with maintenance or staying on the bridge, anywhere I wouldn't have to go back down there. I thought maybe if I just kept my head down, I could get through the voyage without another encounter. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt it. That cold sensation, the creeping sense that something was following me, lurking just out of sight. The crew began to notice that I was on edge. They joked about it, calling me jumpy, but I could see that some of the older sailors knew better. They watched me with the same look Marcus had given me, a mix of sympathy and something else, fear, maybe, or resignation. They knew what I was going through, and they knew there was nothing anyone could do. It was on my 5th night after the incident that things got worse. I had just turned in for the night, lying in my bunk, the rhythmic swaying of the ship usually enough to lull me to sleep. But that night, I couldn't rest. My mind kept drifting back to the figure in orange. I kept seeing it, standing in the shadows, its hollow face staring at me. I tossed and turned, but sleep wouldn't come. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. Suddenly I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged along the metal floor. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I sat up, straining my ears, trying to catch the sound again. There it was, closer this time, a slow, deliberate scrape, followed by a faint shuffle. My mouth went dry as I swung my legs over the side of the bunk, my feet touching the cold metal floor. I reached for the flashlight I kept under my pillow, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the cabin. I swept it across the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound had stopped, but I could still feel it, the sense that something was there, just out of sight, waiting. I forced myself to stand, moving toward the door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, hesitation knotting my stomach. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock the door and hide until morning. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to turn the handle, to face whatever was out there. The door creaked open, and the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the overhead lights. Everything was still, silent, except for the distant hum of the ship's engines. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. I turned to the left, the flashlight beam catching something at the end of the corridor, a flash of orange just for a second, before it disappeared around the corner. I felt my blood run cold. I knew I should turn back, go the other way, wake the rest of the crew if I had to. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me forward, one step at a time, my breathing shallow and rapid. I reached the corner, my heart pounding, and slowly I leaned around it. The hallway was empty. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I lowered the flashlight. I turned back toward my cabin, ready to lock myself in until dawn, when suddenly I heard it again, the scraping sound, directly behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking violently, and there it was. The figure stood in the center of the hallway, wrapped in the bright orange of a survival suit, its face a void of darkness beneath the hood. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, the air around me growing colder and heavier, pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe, my legs frozen in place. And then it started to move toward me, slowly, deliberately, each step echoing against the walls of the narrow corridor. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor, the beam spinning wildly. My eyes were locked on the figure, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might burst. Just as the figure was almost upon me, the ship lurched, a sudden violent shift that threw me off balance. The lights flickered, and for one brief moment everything went dark. When they came back on, the figure was gone. I was on my knees, gasping for breath, the cold receding as quickly as it had come. I didn't wait. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and ran. Ran as fast as I could back to the upper deck, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the stillness of the ship. I burst out onto the deck, the wind whipping at my face, the salt air filling my lungs. I didn't stop until I reached the bridge, where Marcus and a few others were gathered, their faces pale with concern. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, collapsing onto the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. Marcus knelt beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his face grim. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He knew. The rest of the journey passed in a blur. I refused to go below deck, and no one made me. Marcus spoke to the captain, and I was reassigned to duties above, helping with the navigation, anything that kept me away from the lower levels. The crew kept their distance, their eyes wary, as if they feared that whatever had marked me might spread to them. When we finally reached port, I didn't hesitate. I gathered my things, stepped off the ship, and didn't look back. I didn't care about the pay I was owed or the contracts I'd signed. All I cared about was getting as far away from the Sea Wanderer as possible. But even now, months later, I can't escape it. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear it, that soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch a flash of orange, just for a moment, before it disappears into the shadows. I know it's still out there, waiting, and I know that, no matter how far I run, the sea never really lets you go. I don't know why I'm telling you all this, but I guess part of me just needs to say it out loud, to make it real. It happened just a few months ago, after I moved to a new town. It was supposed to be a fresh start, you know? I was excited about it. I wanted to get away from the city, the noise, the stress, all of it, and find some peace in a quieter place. So I ended up in this little town called Ridge Hollow. It seemed like a dream at first. Small population, beautiful scenery, rolling hills, dense forests, and those quaint little cottages that you see in postcards. My new house was cozy, and I thought I'd finally found the perfect place to start over. But that was before the calls started. It was subtle at first. Just a feeling, you know? That strange sense of being watched. I brushed it off as my imagination. Moving somewhere new always comes with a bit of unease, right? Everything was unfamiliar. The creaky old house, the neighbors who all seemed to know each other too well. It was bound to make me feel out of place for a bit. But then the phone calls started, and that's when it all began to feel very, very wrong. It was late one night, maybe a week after I moved in. I was just settling down with a book, trying to unwind, when my phone rang. It wasn't a number I recognized, just some unknown caller. I remember rolling my eyes, thinking it was probably a telemarketer. It was almost 10 p.m. though, which was odd. I answered it anyway, more out of curiosity than anything else. "Hello?" I said. Nothing, just silence. But not the kind of silence you get when a call drops or there's bad reception. No, this was different. I could hear something, a faint sound, almost like breathing. I waited, my heart starting to beat a little faster, and then whoever it was hung up. I tried to tell myself it was just a wrong number, but something about it made me uneasy. The next night, it happened again. This time, it was even later, almost midnight. Same number, same silence, same faint breathing. I hung up, my skin prickling with unease. And after that, it became more frequent. Every other night, sometimes every night. Always around the same time. I stopped answering after a while, but it didn't help. The calls kept coming. I tried blocking the number, but somehow, they always seemed to find a way through. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was knew I was there, alone, sitting in that little house, waiting for the next call. It was like they were trying to remind me that they were out there, watching. One evening, after another one of those calls, I decided I needed to get out of the house. I felt like the walls were closing in on me, and the air was too thick, too oppressive. I thought maybe some fresh air would help. There was this trail nearby, a nice, well-known hiking path that led up into the woods. It was supposed to have great views of the valley, and I'd been meaning to check it out. The sun was just starting to set as I headed up the trail. The air was cool, and the wind rustled through the leaves, filling the forest with this constant, whispering sound. At first, it was peaceful, and I could feel some of the tension easing from my shoulders. But as the light started to fade, that sense of unease crept back in. It wasn't any one thing, it was just a feeling, that prickling at the back of my neck. The wind seemed to pick up, and the trees cast long, twisted shadows across the trail. I felt like I wasn't alone, like there was someone, or something, moving through the woods, keeping pace with me just beyond the edge of my vision. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was only feeling this way because of the creepy phone calls, but it was hard to shake. Then I heard it, a crack, like a branch snapping somewhere off to my right. I stopped dead in my tracks, my ears straining. The forest had gone quiet. No wind, no rustling, just silence. I turned, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the darkening woods and the shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal, but the laughter died in my throat when I heard it again. This time, it was closer. My heart started pounding, and I picked up my pace, moving quickly up the trail. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying to ignore the feeling that there were eyes on me, watching from the dark. I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw them. A couple, maybe in their late 30s, walking toward me. Relief flooded through me, and I almost laughed out loud. They smiled as they approached, and I stopped them, trying to sound casual, even though I could hear the tremor in my voice. "Hey, did you guys see anyone else on the trail?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder. The woman frowned, shaking her head. "No, we haven't seen anyone," she said. "Why? Is something wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. I thought I heard someone following me," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's face grew serious, and he exchanged a glance with the woman. "We were just about to head back to the parking lot," he said. "Why don't you come with us? Safety in numbers, right?" I nodded, grateful. We turned and started back down the trail together, and I felt a little better with them there, the sense of being watched fading slightly. We made small talk as we walked, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, anyone, stepping out from the trees. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I felt like I could breathe again. The lot was empty except for my car and an old pickup truck, probably theirs. The man turned to me, giving me a reassuring smile. "You'll be okay now," he said. "Just be careful, all right?" I nodded, thanking them both before heading to my car. I watched as they got into their truck and drove away, the sound of their engine fading into the night. I stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. The wind rustled through the trees, and the sky was a deep, velvety blue, the first stars just starting to peek through. I turned to unlock my car, but my hand froze on the handle. There on the windshield was a piece of paper. My heart sank, and a cold chill ran down my spine as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. It was a note, scrawled in messy, hurried handwriting. "I see you." My breath caught, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I spun around, my eyes scanning the dark parking lot, the empty trailhead. There was no one there. The forest was silent, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, as if mocking me with their stillness. I got in the car, locking the doors with shaking hands. I could barely breathe as I started the engine, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing behind the car, just out of sight. But there was nothing. Just the empty lot and the dark trail leading back into the woods. I drove home as fast as I could, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I got back to the house, I ran inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I stood there in the entryway, my chest heaving, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Whoever it was, they knew. They knew where I was, what I was doing. They had followed me, watched me, and left that note as a twisted reminder. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. I was tired of feeling helpless, tired of being afraid in my own home. I needed answers. The next day, I went to the police. I showed them the note, told them about the calls, about the man I thought I had heard on the trail. The officer was polite, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. He said they would look into it, that they would patrol the area more frequently, but I could see it in his eyes. He thought I was just another paranoid newcomer jumping at shadows. Days passed and the calls stopped. The sense of being watched slowly faded, and I started to think that maybe, somehow, it was over. Maybe the police presence had scared them off, or maybe they had just gotten bored. Either way, I was grateful. I started to feel normal again, to relax in my own home, to enjoy the quiet of Ridge Hollow. But then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots as I opened it. Sleep well. I'll be seeing you soon. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the panic creeping in. Please, you have to send someone. There's someone watching me. They're still here. They sent me a message. I managed to say, my voice cracking. The dispatcher spoke in a calm, steady tone, asking for my address and assuring me that help was on the way. I hung up, my heart pounding as I tried to think. I needed to get out of there. I needed to go somewhere safe, somewhere with other people. I grabbed my keys and my jacket, my hands fumbling as I locked the front door behind me. The night was cold, the wind biting at my skin as I ran to my car. I looked around, the street dark and empty, the houses around me all quiet. It felt like the whole world had gone to sleep, leaving me alone in the darkness. I got into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from that house, away from that feeling of being watched. I pulled out of the driveway, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the shadows. The roads were empty as I drove through the quiet town, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I tried to focus on the road, to keep my breathing steady, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the message, to the feeling that whoever it was, they were closer than I thought. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the town's small diner. It was one of the only places open that late, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. I parked in the lot and hurried inside, the bell over the door chiming softly as I entered. The warmth and light of the diner were a welcome relief, the smell of coffee and the hum of conversation grounding me in a way that the house never could. I sat down at the counter, my hands still trembling as I ordered a cup of coffee. The waitress gave me a kind smile, but I could tell she noticed the fear in my eyes. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. I just wanted to feel safe, even if it was just for a little while. I took a sip of the coffee, trying to steady my nerves, trying to convince myself that I was safe there, that whoever was following me couldn't reach me in a place like this, surrounded by people. And then, the bell above the door chimed again. I didn't look up at first. I was too focused on the cup in front of me, on the steam rising from the coffee. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. A man standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the diner. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. My heart stopped. He took a step inside, his gaze sweeping over the room, and then his eyes locked on me. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped, like there was nothing else except the two of us, the man in the doorway and me, frozen at the counter. His eyes were dark, empty, and there was something in the way he looked at me that sent a shiver down my spine. He started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my body tensing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I was trapped, cornered in the diner with nowhere to go. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes never leaving mine. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low, almost friendly. But there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. I nodded, my eyes darting to the man at the counter. He was watching us, his eyes cold, calculating. The officer must have sensed my fear, because he stepped between us, his hand resting on the holster at his side. "Sir, I think it's time for you to leave," he said. The man smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stood up slowly, his gaze flicking to me one last time. "I'm sure we'll meet again," he said, his voice dripping with menace. And then he turned and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the night. The officer turned to me, his expression softening. "Ma'am, do you need a ride before?" I nodded, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I followed him out to the car, my eyes scanning the dark parking lot. half expecting to see the man lurking in the shadows. But he was gone, at least for now. The ride home was quiet, the officer asking a few questions, trying to piece together what had happened. I told him about the calls, about the note, about the man. He nodded, his face serious, and promised to have a patrol car keep an eye on my house for the next few nights. But even with the police presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I knew, deep down, that the man wasn't done. He had found me once, and he could find me again. And the worst part was, I knew he enjoyed it. The fear, the control. He wanted me to know he was still out there, waiting, watching. I moved out of Ridge Hollow not long after that. I couldn't stay, not with the constant fear that he was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know where he is now, or if he's still watching me. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I swear I can feel his eyes on me. And I know that no matter how far I run, no matter where I go, he'll always be there, waiting, watching, and reminding me that the nightmare is never really over. You ever get that feeling, like a deep gnawing in your gut, that something is just wrong? That's exactly what I felt the night I drove through New Mexico. It was late, around 1 a.m., and the desert seemed endless, an expanse of darkness and shadows as far as I could see. The moon hung low, casting pale light on the landscape, while the wind howled across the empty highway, like whispers from a ghost. I swear the silence of the place was different. The kind that crept up on you, made you feel like you were being watched, even when you knew damn well there wasn't anyone around. I was driving back to Texas after a work trip, one of those long hauls that you just wanted to be over already. You know the type, where coffee is your only friend, and the road is nothing but a black ribbon stretching out forever. I hadn't seen another car in at least an hour, and the more I drove, the more that feeling started to fester, a little tug in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the late hour and exhaustion playing tricks on me, but the unease wouldn't let go. And then I saw it. The rest stop. A dull green sign with a peeling arrow pointing off the road, promising a place to stretch your legs. I was running low on caffeine, and my eyes were beginning to feel heavy. Stopping, just for a minute, seemed like a good idea. As I pulled in, the headlights illuminated a small parking lot with maybe 3 spaces, cracked asphalt overgrown with weeds. There was a single building, a squat structure with restrooms, dim lights flickering like they were about to give up at any moment. No other cars, no people. The place looked forgotten, and in retrospect, I guess it was a mistake to stop there. But I didn't think too much about it then. I parked, turned off the engine, and stepped out of the car. Immediately, I felt it. Something cold in the air that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was as if the air had teeth. I shivered, trying to brush it off as a chill from the wind. The silence pressed in. I heard nothing except for my footsteps crunching against the gravel and a faint, distant howl of the wind. I headed toward the restroom building. I remember how the light above the door blinked, buzzing like it had a mind of its own, as if deciding whether or not to stay lit for me. I pushed open the door and was met with the sharp scent of bleach mixed with something earthy, like rust, or maybe something worse. The room was empty, silent except for the quiet drip of water from a leaky faucet. Then as I stepped back outside, that's when I noticed the car. There, parked further down in a shadowy corner, a beat-up sedan, the kind you'd see on some old used lot that no one buys. I hadn't noticed it when I pulled in, maybe because it was partially hidden by the shrubs that had taken over the edges of the lot. But now it was impossible to miss. Its door was cracked open, just a sliver, and something was hanging out of it. I squinted, stepping closer, and my stomach knotted. It was a shirt, white, or maybe once white, now smeared with something dark, something that looked suspiciously like blood. My pulse started pounding in my ears, the kind of thud that made everything else fade to background noise. I stopped walking and just stared at it, my mouth suddenly dry. I knew I should turn back, get in my car, and drive the hell out of there, but it was like my feet wouldn't move. Suddenly, there was a sound, like metal grinding against stone, faint but distinct. It cut through the silence of the night, and I swear my heart skipped a beat. My eyes darted around, trying to find the source. It came again, and this time I realized it was coming from inside the building I'd just walked out of, the bathroom. The grinding turned into a scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone sharpening a knife. My blood ran cold, and I fought the urge to just bolt. Slowly I turned, peeking through the crack in the restroom door. And there he was, a man hunched over, the dim flickering light casting his shadow long across the tiled floor. He had his back to me, a large hunting knife in his hands, dragging it across the edge of the sink in slow, deliberate strokes. He wore a dark, stained coat, the kind that looked like it hadn't been washed in years, and his hands were covered in the same dark substance that was on the shirt in the car. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my shoe scuffing against the gravel. The man's head snapped up, and for a split second, I locked eyes with his reflection in the dirty restroom mirror. His face, oh God, his face was twisted, like he was wearing a grin that didn't belong, all teeth and wild eyes. He saw me, and in that instant, I knew I had to run. I turned and sprinted back to my car, every muscle in my body screaming at me to go faster. Behind me, I heard the bathroom door slam open, a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the empty night. I didn't dare look back. The keys were in my pocket, and my hands shook as I fumbled to get them out. I could hear him now, his footsteps pounding against the ground, getting closer. That metallic scrape echoed in my head, like I could still hear the knife being dragged behind him. Finally, I yanked the door open, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat. I jammed the key into the ignition, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the door shut, locking it, just as the man reached the side of the car. I caught one last glimpse of his face in the window, a flash of wild eyes, his mouth moving like he was yelling something, but I couldn't hear it over the sound of my heart hammering in my ears. I floored it, tires skidding on the loose gravel before catching traction and shooting forward. The car fishtailed for a second before I straightened it out, speeding back onto the highway. My hands were clamped so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that man chasing me down the road, but there was nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out behind me. I drove for miles before I finally allowed myself to breathe, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, leaving me shaky and nauseous. I found a gas station, a brightly lit oasis in the middle of nowhere, and pulled over. I sat there in the car, trying to steady my hands enough to call the police. When I finally did, they took my statement, asked me about the rest stop, the car, the man. They promised to send someone out, but the dispatcher's voice had that tired, disinterested tone, like they got calls like this all the time. I couldn't blame her. The whole thing sounded insane, even to me, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew that man would have killed me if I hadn't gotten away. After I hung up, I just sat there, the fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzing overhead. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I was safe now. But the thing is, I never really felt safe after that. Not truly. Even now, months later, every time I drive at night, I catch myself glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see those wild eyes staring back at me. The cops never found anything. They called me a few days later, said they went out to the rest stop, but there was no car, no man, no sign that anything had happened at all. Just an empty parking lot and a broken light flickering over the restroom door. They told me it was probably a drifter, maybe someone playing a prank. But I know what I saw. I know that the fear I felt that night was real. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run. If I'd ignored that feeling in my gut, if I'd stayed just a few seconds longer. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I swear I can still hear that sound, the scrape of metal against stone, the echo of footsteps in the dark. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, he's still out there, waiting for someone else to stop at that lonely rest stop in the middle of nowhere. We weren't kids anymore, but we weren't quite adults either, so Halloween still held some of that mystery and magic for us. It was me, Jenny, Alex, and Todd. The four of us had been friends since middle school, and Halloween was kind of a tradition, something we did every year without really thinking about it. The night was colder than usual. I remember the way my breath would fog up in front of me as we walked, mixing with the laughter that kept bubbling up between us. The streets were decorated like something out of a Halloween movie. Jack-o'-lanterns with flickering candles, cobwebs hanging from doorways, skeletons sitting on front lawns. The wind kept rustling the leaves, making a soft whispering sound that almost drowned out the noises of the other kids around us. We'd been wandering for about an hour when Jenny was the first to notice her. She was just there, a little girl, probably about 10 years old, walking in front of us. She wore this really old-fashioned dress, like something out of a 1950s catalog, cream-colored with lace trim. Her hair was tied into pigtails with matching ribbons, and she was holding one of those classic Halloween pails, the kind shaped like a pumpkin. It was weird, though. She always seemed to be just a few steps ahead, no matter which way we turned. At first, we didn't think much of it. I mean, it's Halloween, right? Kids in costumes are everywhere. But the more we walked, the more unsettling it became. Every time we turned a corner, she was still there, walking ahead of us, like she knew exactly where we were going before we did. She never looked back, never skipped, never ran, just walked, always the same distance in front. It started to feel off. You know that feeling, like an itch at the back of your mind that just won't go away? It was like that. I could feel the energy in our group change. Our laughs started dying down, replaced by whispers. I remember Alex muttering, "Is it just me, or is that kid everywhere we go?" I nodded, trying to shake off the chill that crept over me, but I knew it wasn't just him. We all felt it. Todd tried to brush it off, laughing it away. "Maybe she's just got the same route as us," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. We made a turn onto Maple Street, a dead end we'd taken a million times before. We knew there was no way she could get ahead of us if we took this shortcut, but there she was, at the end of the street, waiting. Just standing there, her back to us, facing the woods. That's when we all stopped. The laughter was gone. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant giggles of kids somewhere far behind us. Jenny tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "How did she get there so fast?" I didn't have an answer. Nobody did. But Alex pulled away and kept walking. We watched as he approached her, and as he got closer, I noticed something. Something that made my skin crawl. The girl's pumpkin pail. It wasn't filled with candy. It looked heavy, like something was weighing it down. The way it hung low in her hand, almost dragging on the ground, made me feel sick for some reason I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Hey," Alex called out, his voice echoing a little too loudly in the quiet street. "You okay? Are you lost?" The girl didn't move. She didn't turn around. She just kept facing the woods. Alex stopped, turning back to us, shrugging with a confused look. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the little girl slowly lifted her free hand, pointing towards the trees. There was something about the way she moved, like her arm was too stiff, like a doll's arm being lifted. The four of us just stood there, frozen, watching. The wind picked up again, colder this time, and I swear I could hear something, like a whisper, but not words, just a soft, hollow sound coming from the woods. It was then that we heard a voice, an older man's voice from behind us. "You kids should leave her be," it said, rough and shaky. We all spun around, and there, standing on the porch of an old, run-down house, was an elderly man. His face was lined with age, his eyes dark and serious. "That girl, she doesn't belong here anymore," he said. His voice was low, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "She died years ago, right there on that road," he added, pointing a gnarled finger towards the woods. I felt my heart drop. I wanted to laugh, to say it was some kind of joke, but the look in his eyes, there was no joke there, only something like pity. I turned back to where the girl had been, but she was gone. The woods were empty, just shadows and the sound of branches swaying in the wind. Todd swore under his breath, and Alex took a step back towards us, his face pale. "Did you see where she went?" he asked, his voice cracking a little. None of us answered. We all just stared at the spot where she had been, the place where the old man said she had died. The man on the porch cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. "She's been looking for her way home ever since," he said, almost like he was talking to himself. "But she never finds it." A chill ran down my spine, and I grabbed Jenny's hand, pulling her back. "Let's go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I didn't need to say it twice. We all turned and started walking back the way we came, our footsteps quick and unsteady. We didn't talk much after that. The excitement of the night had drained away, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Every corner we turned, I found myself looking for her, expecting to see that small figure in the cream-colored dress just ahead of us. But she was gone. The streets were empty now. The other kids had gone home, and the decorations that had seemed festive just an hour before now felt eerie, like they were watching us. When we finally got back to my house, we all sat in the living room, not really knowing what to say. Jenny was the first to break the silence. "Do you think she's still out there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. None of us answered. What could we say? The truth was, we all knew she was. Somewhere out there, that little girl was still walking, still searching for something she'd never find. That night, after my friends left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way she moved, the way she always stayed just ahead of us, like she knew where we were going before we did. I thought about the man's words, about her dying on that road, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't looking for her way home, but for someone to join her. The next morning, I walked down to Maple Street. I don't know why. I guess I just needed to see it in the daylight, to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The street looked normal, just an empty cul-de-sac leading into the woods. But there, at the edge of the trees, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small, cream-colored ribbon caught on a branch, swaying gently in the breeze. I turned and walked away, my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't tell my friends about the ribbon. I didn't tell anyone. But every Halloween since then I've stayed inside. I keep the lights off, the doors locked, and sometimes, late at night, I think I hear something. A soft whisper, the sound of footsteps on the street outside. And I wonder if she's still out there, still looking, still waiting. And I pray she never finds her way to my door. A few years passed after that Halloween, but I could never really shake the feeling that something had changed that night. It was like a piece of the darkness had decided to stick around, hiding in the corners of my life. I didn't talk about it much with my friends anymore. Nobody wanted to bring it up. It was easier to pretend it had all been a weird, spooky coincidence, something we could laugh about if we were brave enough. But the truth was, none of us laughed, and none of us went out on Halloween anymore. It became this unspoken rule between us. Every year, we would just text each other, maybe send a Halloween meme or a joke, but nobody mentioned meeting up. There was always an excuse. "Oh, I'm busy with work," or "I've got a family thing." We knew better, though. We all remembered that night on Maple Street. We all knew she was still there. But last year, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I had moved out of my parents' place and rented a small apartment in a different neighborhood, far enough away that I figured maybe I could escape whatever weird curse had been hanging over us since that Halloween. Things were going okay. I had a new job, I was meeting new people, and I was starting to feel like maybe I could leave that night behind me. It was Halloween again. I tried to tell myself that it was just another day, but there was always that unease that I couldn't shake. I locked my doors, turned off the lights, and settled in with a movie, trying to ignore the sounds of kids laughing outside as they went door to door. It was almost midnight when I heard it, the sound of something tapping against my window. I froze. My apartment was on the second floor, and my bedroom window looked out over a small alleyway. There was no reason for anyone to be out there, no reason for anyone to be tapping on my window. The sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard anything, that it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But something inside me made me turn my head, made me look at the window. There she was, the little girl in the cream-colored dress, her face barely visible through the glass, her eyes wide and empty. She stood there, her hand pressed against the window, her head tilted slightly to the side. I could see her mouth moving, but I couldn't hear anything, just that soft tapping sound of her fingers on the glass. My body went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at her, feeling the room close in around me. Her mouth kept moving, forming words that I couldn't hear. Her eyes locked onto mine. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. One moment she was there, and the next, the window was empty, the alleyway outside dark and still. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty window, my heart pounding in my ears. Eventually, I found the strength to get up, to close the curtains and lock myself in the bathroom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I stayed in there until the sun came up, my back pressed against the door, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had been a dream, some kind of waking nightmare brought on by too much stress and not enough sleep. But when I went to the window, I saw it. A small handprint smudged against the glass. Tiny, like a child's. I moved out of that apartment a week later, packed up everything I owned, and found a place on the other side of town, somewhere that felt safe, somewhere that didn't have any memories attached to it. I didn't tell anyone why I was moving. What could I say? That I was being haunted by the ghost of a little girl who had died years ago. It sounded insane, even to me. I haven't seen her since, but I know she's still out there. I can feel it, that cold, creeping dread that follows me whenever Halloween comes around. I keep the lights off, I stay inside, and I pray that she doesn't find me again. I've tried to move on, tried to live my life without looking over my shoulder, but it's always there, that feeling that I'm not alone. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear something, a soft tapping, a whisper in the dark, and I'll wonder if she's found me again. If she's still looking for her way home, or if maybe she's looking for something else now, someone else. And I wonder, if I ignore her long enough, will she go away, or will she just keep getting closer until there's nowhere left for me to run? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out. This year, Halloween is coming up again, and the fear is already starting to settle in. I've thought about leaving town, driving somewhere far away where maybe she won't find me. But deep down, I know it doesn't matter. She's not tied to a place, she's tied to me, to that night, to whatever mistake we made by following her. And now, all I can do is wait. Wait and hope that maybe this year she'll decide to leave me alone. But if she doesn't, if she comes back, if I hear that tapping on my window again, I don't know what I'll do. Maybe I'll open the window. Maybe I'll finally hear what she's been trying to say all these years. Or maybe I'll just run. Run and keep running until there's nowhere left to hide. It's funny, the little things that can make a normal evening turn into a nightmare. It had been an ordinary Wednesday night with nothing particularly remarkable about it. Until, of course, it wasn't. The day had been busy, just like any other day with a young child. I spent most of it chasing after my 5-year-old son, Noah, who had an endless supply of energy. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, the sky blushing with purples and pinks, I was finally settling down, feeling that comforting exhaustion that only comes after a long but fulfilling day. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, while Noah was playing in the living room, his small toy cars scattered across the carpet. The air was calm and everything seemed perfectly normal, until I heard his voice. "Mommy," Noah called, his tone hesitant, almost confused. "Mommy, there's a man outside." I stopped scrubbing the dish in my hand and looked up, my heart giving an unexpected jolt. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way Noah said it. His voice held a kind of bewildered innocence, something so out of place that it made me feel a chill down my spine. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light as I dried my hands on a towel. I made my way from the kitchen into the living room, where Noah stood near the window, his small fingers resting on the windowsill. He was staring intently out into the dim backyard. I swallowed, a nervous smile twitching at my lips. "Is it Mr. Johnson next door?" I asked, my voice a little tighter now. Mr. Johnson had a habit of coming around unannounced to offer us vegetables from his garden. It was strange, sure, but not scary. I was hoping, really hoping, that Noah was just talking about Mr. Johnson. Noah shook his head, his gaze still fixed on whatever was outside. "No, Mommy," he said, his voice soft. "He's not Mr. Johnson. He's just standing there, staring at me." A prickling sense of unease washed over me as I moved closer to Noah. The way he said "just standing there" sounded so off. I looked out the window, expecting, maybe hoping, to see nothing, but my breath caught in my throat. There was in fact a man standing just outside the window. He was tall, his silhouette barely distinguishable against the night sky. He wasn't moving, not even a bit. I couldn't make out his face, it was too dark, but I could see the shape of his body, still as a statue, almost blending into the darkened backdrop of our backyard. He was standing close to the window, so close that it felt like he was trying to peer inside. My heart thudded violently, and I instinctively pulled Noah back, placing my arm protectively in front of him. I tried to swallow the fear that was starting to build in my chest. Why didn't I hear a knock? Why didn't the dog bark? I thought, my mind racing, but those questions would have to wait. I had to keep Noah safe. With my free hand, I slowly pulled the curtain over the window, blocking out the sight of the figure. I didn't want Noah to be frightened. He was still so young, so innocent, and I had to make sure he stayed that way. "It's okay, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why don't you go upstairs and play with your toys for a bit? Mommy's just going to check something, okay?" Noah looked up at me, his big blue eyes wide. "Okay, Mommy," he said, his voice almost a whisper, and he toddled off toward the stairs. I waited until I heard his small footsteps reach the top, and then I turned my attention back to the window. I peeked through the edge of the curtain, just enough to see outside. My stomach sank. The man was still there. He hadn't moved an inch. He was standing in the exact same spot, facing the window, as if he knew I was watching him. There was something so profoundly wrong about the way he stood, motionless, unnatural. I backed away from the window, my pulse quickening. My thoughts were a jumble of fear and confusion. Who was this man, and why was he here? We lived in a quiet neighborhood. This sort of thing just didn't happen. I grabbed my phone from the counter, my fingers trembling slightly as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man outside my window, I whispered, glancing toward the curtain as if afraid the figure might hear me through the walls. He's just standing there, and I don't know who he is. The dispatcher asked me a few questions, and I answered as best as I could. No, the man hadn't tried to get inside. No, I didn't know what he looked like. It was too dark. Yes, I was home alone with my child. They assured me that an officer would be dispatched immediately. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding. I wanted to go upstairs, to sit with Noah until help arrived, but something made me stay in the living room, my eyes glued to the curtain. I needed to know if he moved. I needed to know if he tried to come closer. Minutes ticked by like hours, the silence of the house pressing in on me, the only sound the distant ticking of the clock on the mantel. And then, just when I thought the tension might crush me, I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something brushing against the window pane. My breath caught. Slowly, I crept toward the window, the floor creaking beneath my feet. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I lifted the edge of the curtain, just enough to see outside. The man was gone. The backyard was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. I stared out into the darkness, my heart still racing. Where had he gone? I hadn't heard him move. Hadn't heard anything except that soft rustling. The sudden sound of knocking made me jump, and I nearly dropped the curtain. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the front door. The police, I thought, relief flooding through me. I rushed to the door, unlocking it with trembling hands. 2 officers stood on the porch, their expressions serious. I opened the door wide, gesturing toward the living room. "He was right out there by the window," I said, my voice shaking. I don't know where he went." The officers exchanged a look, then nodded. One of them, a tall man with a kind face, stepped inside. "Ma'am, why don't you stay here with my partner while I take a look around?" he said, his voice calm and reassuring. I nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. The other officer, a woman with sharp eyes, stayed with me, asking me a few questions about what I had seen. I answered as best as I could, my eyes flicking nervously toward the window. I just wanted them to find him, to tell me that everything was going to be okay. It felt like an eternity before the officer returned. He stepped back inside, shaking his head. "We didn't see anyone," he said, his brow furrowed. "No footprints, no signs of anyone being out there." I stared at him, my stomach sinking. But he was there, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He was right there, staring in at us. The officer nodded, his expression sympathetic. We believe you, ma'am. We'll do a patrol of the neighborhood, see if we can find anything. But for now, just make sure your doors and windows are locked, okay? I nodded, my throat tight. The officers left, and I locked the door behind them, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place far too loud in the empty house. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the door, trying to steady my breathing. It was over, I told myself. He was gone. But as I turned to head upstairs, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, something that made my blood run cold. There, on the living room window, just visible in the faint light from the street lamp outside, was the outline of a handprint. A smudge against the glass, fingers spread wide, as if someone had pressed their hand against the window, peering in. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the handprint, the fear creeping back in. He had been there. He had been right there, just inches from where my son had stood. I ran upstairs, my feet barely touching the steps, and found Noah in his room, playing quietly with his toys. He looked up at me and smiled, his innocence piercing through the fear that gripped me. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tight, feeling his small, warm body against mine. He giggled, squirming slightly. "Mommy, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity. I forced a smile, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Nothing, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling. "Mommy's just happy you're safe," I repeated, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that everything really was okay. But even as I held him close, I couldn't shake the image of that handprint on the window. So real, so vivid. I knew then that the fear wouldn't just go away, not until I knew who the man was and why he was there. That night, I barely slept. I stayed in Noah's room, sitting in the old armchair by his bed, watching over him as he slept peacefully, unaware of the terror that had gripped our home. I tried to stay awake, listening for any sound, any rustle that might signal the man's return. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and my eyes grew heavy, my head nodding against the back of the chair. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise, soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I sat up, my ears straining to catch it again. It sounded like footsteps moving slowly down the hallway outside Noah's room. The floorboards creaked softly, the kind of sound that only came when someone was trying to move quietly, trying not to be heard. My heart hammered in my chest as I rose from the chair, careful not to make a sound. I glanced at Noah, still fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. And then I moved to the door, my hands shaking as I grasped the doorknob. I turned it slowly, easing the door open just enough to peek into the hallway. The hallway was empty, the shadows long and deep in the dim light filtering in from the nightlight in the bathroom. I stepped out, my bare feet silent against the cool floor. I could still hear it, that faint, almost rhythmic creaking, like footsteps moving further away. It was coming from downstairs. I moved cautiously, each step deliberate, careful not to let the floorboards creak beneath my weight. I reached the top of the stairs and peered down into the darkness below. The living room was a mass of shadows, nothing but vague shapes of furniture barely visible in the faint glow from the street lamp outside. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hallway near the front door. My breath caught in my throat, my whole body tensing as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. It was him, the man from the window. He was standing there, his back to me, his head slightly bowed, as if listening for something. For a split second, I thought about turning back, about running to Noah and locking us both in his room until help arrived. But something in me snapped, a fierce, protective instinct that overpowered my fear. This man, whoever he was, had invaded my home. He had stood outside my window watching my child, and now he was inside, creeping through my house like a shadow. I couldn't let him stay. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a heavy candle holder from the small table by the stairs. I gripped it tightly, my palms sweaty, and slowly started to descend the stairs. My heart pounded, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back, but I kept moving, one step at a time, my eyes never leaving the figure at the end of the hallway. I was halfway down when the man moved. He turned, his head lifting slightly, and for the first time, I could see his face. Or, more accurately, the lack of it. His features were obscured, blurred somehow, like looking at a reflection in a foggy mirror. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. He started to move, his footsteps slow and deliberate, coming toward the stairs. I didn't think, I couldn't. My body moved on its own, driven by instinct. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound that tore through the silence of the house, and I rushed down the stairs, the candle holder raised. The figure paused, as if startled, and for a moment it almost seemed to shimmer, the edges of its body blurring like smoke. I swung the candle holder with all my strength, and for one terrifying second I thought it would pass right through him. But then it connected with a solid thud, and the figure crumpled to the ground, dissolving into darkness. I stood there, panting, my hands trembling violently as I clutched the candle holder, my eyes wide as I stared at the spot where the figure had been. There was nothing there, no body, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Just the darkness, pressing in from all sides, and the echo of my scream still hanging in the air. I heard Noah calling from upstairs, his voice small and frightened. "Mommy, what's happening?" I dropped the candle holder, my legs feeling weak beneath me as I turned and ran back up the stairs. Noah was standing in his doorway, his eyes wide with fear. I scooped him up into my arms, holding him close, trying to steady my breathing. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's okay. Everything's going to be okay." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed in Noah's room, holding him close, my eyes fixed on the door, listening for any sound. But the house was silent. The oppressive feeling that had filled the air somehow lifted, as if whatever had been there was gone. The next morning, I called the police again, and they came to check the house, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside. The officer, a different one this time, a young man with a kind face, tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He thought I had imagined it, that my fear had gotten the better of me. All I can do is hold Noah close and pray that whatever it is, whatever he is, stays away. Because the man at the window, he isn't just a memory. He's a shadow that lingers, a reminder that sometimes the things we fear most aren't just in our heads. Sometimes they're standing just outside, waiting to be let in. I never thought a simple vacation could turn into the worst nightmare of my life. Rome, beautiful, historic Rome. I'd been saving for years, dreaming about this trip, and when I finally landed, I felt like I was walking through a postcard. Everything looked just like it did in the movies. Bustling streets, ancient ruins tucked between colorful buildings, fountains echoing with the splash of water. But now, when I think of Rome, I don't see those wonders. I see the dark alleyways, and I hear the sound of footsteps getting closer. It all started on my third day in the city. I had just spent the afternoon wandering through a market near Campo de' Fiori, buying souvenirs and snacking on fresh bread, feeling like I belonged among the crowd of tourists and locals. The sun was dipping low, painting everything in gold, and the city buzzed with that early evening energy that made you want to just keep going. But then it happened. A sharp jolt from behind, a hand at my side, and suddenly I was stumbling forward, my wallet gone from my back pocket. It took me a second to realize what had happened. The guy was fast, a blur of dark clothing disappearing into the crowd. I felt my heart pound in my chest, and without even thinking, I took off after him. I should have known better. You're always told not to run after a pickpocket, that it's not worth it. But there was something inside me that just wouldn't let go. All my cards, my ID, everything I needed to get home was in that wallet. I followed him down the narrow, winding streets, my feet slapping against the cobblestones, trying to keep my eyes on his dark jacket. The market noise faded away, replaced by the sound of my own gasping breath and the echo of my footsteps. He turned a corner, then another, leading me deeper into a maze of alleyways that grew darker with every twist and turn. The buildings leaned over the narrow street, blocking out what was left of the sunlight. My lungs were burning, but somehow I managed to keep up. The alleys were empty now, just me and him, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. I rounded another corner and almost lost him, just a flash of movement disappearing behind an old rusted gate. I threw myself after him, And there, finally in a small, cramped courtyard, I caught up. He was cornered, panting, his eyes wide. He must have thought he'd lost me. I grabbed for my wallet, my hands trembling, and he just tossed it at me, like it was nothing, just a piece of trash. He sneered at me, muttering something in Italian that I didn't understand, but the malice was clear enough. I picked up the wallet, relieved that everything seemed to be there, and that was when I heard it, the scream. It was high-pitched, echoing through the courtyard, bouncing off the walls until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My heart dropped, and for a second, I froze. Then, before I could even register what was happening, two men burst through a side door, a woman between them, clutching her arm, her face twisted in pain and fear. She saw me, her eyes locking onto mine, and suddenly she was pointing at me, shouting something over and over, her voice filled with terror. Lui mi ha attaccato, she screamed, her finger stabbing the air in my direction. I didn't understand the words, but I knew enough to get the meaning. She was accusing me, of all people. I stammered, tried to say something, anything, but my words tangled in my throat. The men rushed at me, shouting, grabbing my arms. The thief was gone. He must have slipped away in the chaos. And there I was, my wallet in hand, being dragged out of the courtyard while the woman kept crying, her eyes full of something that made my blood run cold. The next few hours were a blur. They called the police, and I found myself in the back of a car, the blue lights flashing around me, painting everything in a surreal, nightmarish glow. I kept trying to explain, to tell them I wasn't the one who attacked her, that I was just trying to get my wallet back. But they weren't listening. I could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the judgment. I was a foreigner, alone, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They took me to the station, sat me down in a small, cold room with walls that seemed to close in on me with every passing second. They asked me questions, their voices sharp, like they were trying to catch me in a lie. I explained over and over again, but the more I talked, the less sense it seemed to make, even to me. The thief was gone. The woman said I was the one who'd hurt her, and no one else had seen what had really happened. I felt the walls pressing in, the panic building in my chest until I could barely breathe. The next day, they moved me to a holding cell, the kind you see in movies. Bars, cold cement floors, the stale stench of sweat and fear hanging in the air. There were other men in there, all watching me with empty eyes, sizing me up. I sat down on the bench, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of how I'd ended up here. I kept replaying it in my mind, that moment in the courtyard, the woman's eyes filled with terror, her finger pointing right at me. A week later, they took me to court. I stood there, in front of a judge, my stomach twisting into knots, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. The prosecutor spoke in rapid Italian, the words washing over me in a wave of sound that I couldn't make sense of. The woman was there too, her arm bandaged, her eyes still filled with that same fear. She wouldn't look at me directly, just kept glancing away, her face pale. My lawyer, assigned by the state, told me I could face years in prison if they found me guilty. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How had it come to this? A simple vacation, a stolen wallet, and now I was looking at losing everything. My freedom, my life, all because of a misunderstanding that no one seemed to want to correct. The courtroom felt like it was spinning. I could see people whispering, the judge frowning, the prosecutor speaking with that cold certainty that made my skin crawl. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of it all pulling me under, until I thought I might just pass out from the pressure. And then, just as I thought it was over, that there was no hope, someone spoke up. A voice from the back of the courtroom, loud, clear, cutting through the chaos. Aspettate! Wait! Everyone turned, and there he was, a man I hadn't noticed before, stepping forward, his face set with determination. He spoke quickly, his voice confident, his words flowing in that same rapid Italian that I struggled to follow. But I could tell from the way my lawyer's face changed, from the way the prosecutor frowned, that whatever this man was saying, it was important. They called him to the front, and he spoke for what felt like hours. He had been there, he said. He had seen the thief, had seen me chasing him, had heard the scream from the courtyard, and had watched as I was dragged away. I couldn't understand everything he said, but as he spoke, I felt the weight lifting, the tension in the room shifting. The prosecutor's voice lost its edge. The judge's frown softened, and slowly I began to breathe again. The man, my unexpected savior, finished speaking, and the courtroom fell silent. The judge looked at me, then at the prosecutor, before finally nodding. My lawyer leaned over to me, his voice low, whispering, "I think they believe him. I think you're going to be okay." It wasn't immediate. There were still hours of waiting, of questions, of uncertainty. But finally, they told me I could go. I stepped out of that courtroom, the sunlight almost blinding after so many days under the cold, flickering lights of the holding cell. I walked out onto the street, the air cool against my face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I could breathe again. The man who had testified for me was waiting outside. He introduced himself, Marco, and explained that he had been in the courtyard that day, too far away to get involved but close enough to see what had happened. He had recognized my face on the news, had heard about the case, and had decided to come forward. I didn't know how to thank him. How do you thank someone for giving you your life back? He smiled, shrugged, and told me that sometimes people just do the right thing, and that I shouldn't think too much about it. But I couldn't help it. Every time I think back to that trip, to those days spent in fear, wondering if I would ever see my family again, I think of Marco, and of the way the world can turn on a single moment, a single decision. The rest of my time in Rome was a blur. I didn't stay long. I caught the next flight home, my suitcase hastily packed, my heart still heavy with everything that had happened.